Velenthorn was mending his leaking roof in the freezing rain. A fool's task. The rain found new ways in faster than he could patch the old ones. It was a war of attrition, and the sky had endless reserves. He knew the rules of his miserable life in the village of Oakhaven. Rule 1. Mind your own business. Looking too closely at a neighbor's trouble only invited it to your own door. Rule 2. Pay Lord Critch on time. The ledger was a god more merciless than any ancient deity, and Critch was its high priest. And the third, unspoken rule, the one carved into the very bones of the village elders: never, ever trust an orc. They were monsters. The stories said so. History said so. But when he sloshed through the mud toward the thin woods bordering his property, hunting for a fallen branch that wasn't completely waterlogged, he found her, an orc, collapsed in a heap of dark leather and green skin, a broken giantess half submerged in a muddy puddle, a wicked-looking axe lying uselessly beside her. And huddled beneath her arm, shielded from the worst of the downpour, was a child, a small, shivering orc child, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it transcended species. Villain saw a deep, bleeding gash on the warrior's arm, dark blood mixing with the rain and mud. They were dying. He broke the most important rule of all. And that choice, that single, foolish, compassionate choice, changed everything. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the steady beat of the rain. Every instinct screamed at him. Run, hide, pretend you saw nothing. This was not his business. This was the kind of trouble that didn't just knock on your door. It kicked the door down, burned the house, and salted the earth. Orcs were death. They were the whispered tales parents used to frighten children into obedience. They were the reason the Baron kept a garrison 2 days' ride away. 2, but the child, the little one. His face was pinched, and pale beneath its green hue. His tusks were barely nubs, and he trembled not with rage, but with a cold that Violin knew in his own bones. It was the deep, seeping cold of hunger and hopelessness. Violin saw his own reflection in that desperate, small face. An outcast, frightened, alone. The warrior groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure agony. Her eyes, the color of moss and fury, fluttered open for a second. They weren't the burning red coals of the stories. They were just eyes, filled with pain. She tried to pull the child closer, a final protective gesture. Then her head slumped back into the mud. Violin's choice was no choice at all. His fatal strength, his absolute inability to ignore suffering, took hold. It was a curse that kept his larder empty and his heart full. He couldn't leave them. He just couldn't. Getting her back to the hovel was a nightmare. She was heavy, impossibly so, all dense muscle and bone, even unconscious. Villain was a man made of twigs and twine. Weakened by years of thin soup and gnawing debt, he heaved, he strained, he slipped in the mud, his face planting into the cold, wet earth. He tasted grit and despair. The little orc, Grark, as Villain would later learn, watched him with an unnerving stillness. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He just watched Villain struggle with the weight of his protector, his entire world. There was no trust in his eyes, only a silent, waiting judgment. Villain finally managed to get his shoulder under her arm. He half dragged, half carried her, his boots sucking in the mud with each agonizing step. The short distance to his shack felt like a journey across a continent. The rain plastered his thin hair to his skull and ran in rivulets down his back, cold as a wraith's touch. Inside, the situation was hardly better. His one-room hovel was a symphony of drips. Plink, plonk, drip, each drop landing in one of the dozen clay pots and cracked bowls scattered across the floor. The air smelled of damp earth, wet wool, and the pervasive mold that was poverty's signature scent. It was a pathetic sanctuary, but it was dry. Mostly. He lowered the orc warrior, Kaza, onto his own straw pallet, the only soft thing he owned. It immediately began to soak up the rain from her leathers. The child, Grark, scurried into the darkest corner, pulling his knees to his chest, making himself as small as possible. A shadow in the shadows. Vilain stared at them. What have I done? The question echoed in the dripping silence. Lord Critch was due his payment in a week. Vilain had nothing, less than nothing. And now he had 2 more mouths to feed. Mouths of a kind that would get him hanged. Or worse, exiled. He shook the fear away. First things first. The wound. He lit a precious tallow candle, its weak light pushing back gloom. The gash on her arm was deep, jagged, and ugly. It looked like it was made by something other than a clean blade. Something with teeth. It was already inflamed, the skin around it a bruised and angry purple. He tore a strip from one of his 2 shirts. It was worn thin, but it was clean. He boiled water from his rain collection bucket over his tiny fire, adding the last of his healing herbs, a small bunch of yarrow he'd gathered in the summer. The hovel filled with the sharp, clean scent. He approached the pallet. The warrior was still unconscious, her breathing shallow. He hesitated, his hand hovering over her green skin. This close, he could see the scars that crisscrossed her face, the chip in one of her tusks, the sheer exhaustion etched into every line of her powerful jaw. She was not a monster from a story. She was a soldier from a war he couldn't imagine. Gently, he began to clean the wound. She flinched, a growl rumbling in her chest, even in her stupor. Grak hissed from the corner. A tiny, fierce sound. "I'm helping," Vilain whispered, his voice hoarse. He didn't know if the child understood his words, but maybe he would understand the tone. "I'm trying to help." He worked carefully, his fingers surprisingly steady. He cleaned away the mud and grime, flushing the wound with the warm, herbed water. He then wrapped the arm tightly with the clean cloth. A poor bandage for a warrior's wound, but it was all he had. His work done, he turned to the fire, his own dinner. A handful of withered turnips and a single, sad-looking potato floating in a pot of water. It wasn't a meal. It was a memory of one. He ladled the thin soup into 2 of his 3 bowls. He took one to the corner where the child hid. He set it on the floor, a safe distance away. "For you," he said softly. He backed away, giving the boy space. Grak stared at the bowl. He looked from the steaming, watery soup to Vilain, then back again. The ache of hunger was a universal language. Slowly, hesitantly, he crept forward. He snatched the bowl and retreated back into his corner, sipping the hot liquid with a desperate thirst. Vilain watched him, a pang of something sharp and painful in his chest. He then turned to the warrior on his bed. She was stirring. Her eyes opened, hazy at first, then sharpening with an alarming speed. They locked onto him. Fear, cold and absolute, shot through Vilain. This was it. The moment she realized where she was, realized he was a weak, helpless human. The moment she killed him. She pushed herself up on her good arm, her muscles bunching. A low growl started in her throat. Her eyes darted around the tiny shack, taking in the dripping ceiling, the meager fire, and finally Grak in the corner, clutching the empty soup bowl. Her gaze softened. The growl died. She looked at the fresh bandage on her arm. She looked at Vilain, standing there, trembling slightly, holding the other bowl of soup. There was no threat in his posture, only a weary, rain-soaked pity. He held out the bowl, an offering, a truce. Kaza stared at the bowl, then back at his face. She saw no trickery, no malice. She saw the hollows in his cheeks, the threadbare cloth of his tunic. She saw a poverty that mirrored her own desperation. He was offering her his own meal, possibly his only meal. Slowly she reached out her good hand and took the bowl. Her fingers brushed his. Her skin was cool, his warm. For a moment, they just looked at each other over the steaming soup. An orc warrior and a human outcast. 2 broken people, finding a moment of quiet understanding in a dripping shack at the edge of the world. In that silence, they both realized the same thing. They were alone. And for tonight, at least, They were alone together. If you believe that kindness matters more than species, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about unlikely heroes. Now, back to Villain's decision. Because things were about to get dangerous. The first few days were a tense ballet of avoidance in a space too small for a single dancer. Kaza remained mostly on the pallet, a silent, brooding mountain of green muscle. She spoke little, her words short and clipped, more like stones than sounds. She would watch Villain with an unnerving intensity, her moss-colored eyes tracking his every move as he refilled the drip pots, stoked the fire, or stared out the single, grimy window at the unforgiving world. Grak was her shadow. He never strayed more than an arm's length from Kaza, and if Villain came too close, the boy would bare his tiny tusks in a hiss that was a miniature echo of his sister's dormant fury. Trust was a fragile seed, and the ground of their shared existence was hard, frozen rock. Villain's own fear was a constant, cold companion. He slept sitting in his one rickety chair, the rusty key to his hovel clutched in his hand. It was a worthless object, a key to a door that barely locked, but it was his. It symbolized the little he had. He'd wake with a start in the deep of the night, the sound of Kaza's heavy breathing filling the small space, and his heart would seize. A monster in his house, a monster he had invited in. But then he would see her, in the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls, wincing in her sleep as her wound throbbed. He would see Grak curled against her side, his small hand clutching her leather tunic, and the fear would recede, replaced by that damnable, ruinous compassion. They weren't just orcs, they were Kaza and Grak. They had names. Food was the most pressing problem. His larder was a hollow cavern of despair. The watery turnip soup was gone. All he had left was a small sack of coarse flour, crawling with weevils. On the third day, Kaza pushed herself to her feet. She swayed, her face pale, but her jaw was set with determination. "There is no food," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I know," Villain said, his voice barely a whisper. The shame of it burned in his gut. Kaza walked to the door, leaning against the frame for support. She looked out at the damp, grey woods. The forest provides, for those who know how to look. She took a few steps outside, Grak trailing at her heels. Villain watched, worried. She was still weak, but after a few minutes she returned, holding a handful of gnarled, muddy roots. "Krala root," she grunted, tossing them onto the table. "Good for soup, fills the belly." Villain stared at them. He had lived his whole life next to these woods, and had seen these roots 1,000 times. He'd always assumed they were poison. I didn't know." "Humans are blind," Kaza said, but there was no malice in it. It was a simple statement of fact. You look, but you do not see. That evening, they had soup. It was thick and earthy, with a taste Villain had never known. It was more than food. It was a lesson. While they ate, Kaza noticed the constant drip from the roof. One particularly large drop splashed right into Villain's bowl. He barely flinched, so used to it he was. The next day, while Villain was out trying to scavenge firewood, he returned to a strange sight. Kaza was on his roof. She moved slowly, favoring her wounded arm, but with a purpose that was terrifying to behold. She was ripping off his pathetic patches and rearranging the warped, rotting shingles with an expert eye. She saw the structural flaws he had been trying to patch with wishful thinking. "What are you doing?" he cried out, panicked. That roof was the only thing keeping the world out. "Fixing this," she called down, her voice firm. "Your patches are an insult to wood." She pointed with her chin to a leaning support beam inside the hovel. "That beam will fail before the next full moon. Your house is trying to die." Over the next few days, a strange domesticity settled in. Kaza, with her warrior's knowledge of structure and survival, directed Villain. She showed him how to brace the beam with a length of solid oak she'd found. She taught him which fungi were good to eat and which would kill him. Grak, seeing that Villain was not a threat, began to uncurl from his silent ball of fear. He found a piece of scrap wood and one of Villain's dull knives and began to whittle. To Villain's astonishment, the boy was an artist. He carved a perfect, tiny bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. He shyly offered it to Villain. Villain took the small carving, his rough fingers tracing its delicate shape. It was the first gift he had received in years. A warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He looked at Grach, at Kaza, watching them both, and for the first time, the hovel felt less like a leaking shelter and more like a home. The silence between them was no longer heavy with suspicion, but comfortable, filled with the quiet sounds of their shared existence. But the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. A heavy knock on the door shattered their fragile peace. It was not the knock of a neighbor. It was the hard, impatient rap of authority. Violent's blood ran cold. Lord Critch, or his man. Kaza's eyes went wide with alarm. In an instant, the warrior was back. She grabbed Grach, pulling him behind her, and melted into the darkest corner of the room, her hand instinctively going to the axe that was never far from her side. She became a shadow, utterly silent. Violent took a deep breath, his heart a frantic bird in his chest, and opened the door. It was Bailiff Hargrove, a stout man whose belly strained the buttons of his tunic. He had a face like a sour plum, and the smug air of a man who enjoys the misery of others. Behind him stood two of Critch's guards, their faces impassive and cruel. "Thorn," Hargrove sneered, his eyes roving over Villain's pathetic form and then past him, into the dim interior of the hovel. "His lordship has noted your account. It is deficient." "I have another week," Villain stammered. The agreement was for the end of the month. "His lordship is restructuring his payment schedules for the good of the community," Hargrove said, an oily smile spreading across his face. "Your payment is now due in 2 days, the full amount, plus a late fee for your anticipated failure." He sniffed the air. "What is that smell? Something's different. Richer. You been holding out on us, Thorn?" Villain's mind raced. The krala root soup, it smelled of something other than watery turnips. "Just some mushrooms from the woods, sir." Hargrove's eyes narrowed. He took a step as if to enter, to inspect the premises for any hidden assets. Villain stood his ground, blocking the doorway with his frail body. It was a laughable gesture. Hargrove could have swatted him aside like a fly. But Villain did not move. 2 days, Thorn," Hargrove spat, his good humour gone. "Or we'll have you and this pile of sticks out on the road. And his lordship will take his payment from your hide." He turned and marched away, his guards following like well-trained hounds. Villain watched them go, his body trembling with a mixture of relief and terror. He closed the door, leaning his forehead against the rough wood. 2 days. It was a death sentence. He turned back into the room. Kaza emerged from the shadows, her face a mask of cold fury. "Dead," she said, the word a curse. "We have this in my land too. Leeches who feed on the honourable." "I have nothing," Villain said, his voice cracking. "I can't pay him." "Then we fight," she said simply, her hand resting on the pommel of her axe. "Fight Lord Critch. With what? He has guards, the Baron's law on his side. I have a rusty key and a leaking roof." Despair washed over him, thick and suffocating. He slumped into his chair. "It's over." Before Kaza could respond, a small sound came from the window. A gasp. Villain's head snapped up. A child's face was pressed against the grimy pane. A village girl named Ilara. Her eyes were wide as saucers, her mouth a perfect O of shock. She had seen them. She had seen Kaza. The face vanished. Footsteps pounded away through the mud. Silence. A new kind of silence. The silence of a fuse being lit. "She saw us," Villain breathed. Kaza's expression was grim. She knew what this meant. Fear of the unknown was the same in every language, in every village. It didn't take long. Less than an hour. First, It was a murmur from the direction of the village. Then the murmur grew into a clamor. Then came the lights, torches, a wave of angry flickering fire moving through the twilight toward them. "They come," Kaza said, her voice low. She grabbed her axe. Grak whimpered and clung to her leg. "Stay behind me." "No," Velin said, surprising himself as much as her. He stood up, his legs shaky, but his resolve hardening into something that felt like iron. He walked to the door. "This is my home. They are my people. I will speak to them." "They will kill you," Kaza warned, "and then they will kill us." "Maybe," Velin said, his hand on the latch. "But you don't fight your neighbors with an axe. You fight them with words." He opened the door and stepped outside, closing it firmly behind him to keep Kaza and Grak hidden. The mob was 20 strong, maybe more. Farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, his neighbors, and their faces, in the flickering torchlight, were twisted with fear and hatred. They were armed with pitchforks, sickles, and heavy clubs. "Villain!" shouted the blacksmith, a man named Joran. "Step aside. We know what you're hiding in there. Elara saw it. An orc." "A monster!" another voice screamed. "It'll kill us in our beds." Villain held up his hands, trying to project a calm he did not feel. "Please, listen to me. There is no monster here." "Liar!" someone yelled. A rock flew past his head, thudding against the wooden wall of the hovel. "They are refugees." Vilen's voice rose, stronger now, filled with a desperate passion. A warrior and her child brother. They were wounded, starving, just like any of us would be if we were driven from our homes. Are we so full of fear that we can't see suffering when it's right in front of us? "Orcs don't suffer," Joran bellowed. "They cause suffering." "This one didn't," Velin shot back. "She was dying in the mud. I gave her my soup. I bandaged her wound. And in return, she has helped me. She fixed my roof. She showed me food in the forest where I saw only weeds. Is that the act of a monster?" Inside, Kaza listened, her breath caught in her throat. She had been ready for a fight, ready to die protecting her brother. She was not ready for this. This frail human, standing between her and a mob, defending her with nothing but his voice. He was willing to be torn apart for them, for strangers, for orcs. The foundation of her world, built on clan, strength, and battle, trembled. She had seen courage on the battlefield, the courage of a berserker's charge, of a last stand. But this was a different kind of courage, quieter, more profound. A bond was forming, not of blood, not of clan, but of choice. A heartwood bond, as the old law called it, unspoken, unbreakable. When Villain finally came back inside, his face pale but his eyes blazing, the mob had retreated, for now. They were confused, their anger diluted by his words, but they were not convinced. They would be back. Kaza looked at him, her expression unreadable. "That was a foolish thing to do." "It was the only thing to do," he replied, slumping against the door. She was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice low and heavy with memory. "They hunt me for a reason, not just because I am an orc." Velin looked up, waiting. "I was part of the Skull Render clan," she began. "Under Warlord Thrathrak. He was once a great leader, honorable. But the wars, the endless wars changed him. He grew hungry, not for food, but for power. He began to listen to whispers from dark places. He started practicing old forbidden rituals, blood magic." Her voice dropped, filled with disgust. "He demanded sacrifices, not from our enemies, from our own, the weak, the young, to fuel his strength. He said it was for the good of the clan. He said it was a necessary price for victory." She pulled Grak closer, her hand resting on his head. "Grak was chosen for the next ritual. Thrathrak called it an honor. I called it murder. I defied him. I fought my way out of the camp with Grak. The wound on my arm, it is from a beast he summoned. I am not just a refugee, Villain Thorn. I am a deserter, a traitor, and Thrathrak's Skull Render will not stop until he has my head and my brother's life." The weight of her words settled in the small room, heavier than any debt. Villain had not just invited in 2 orcs. He had invited in a war. Can you believe they did that? If you're rooting for this strange family to survive, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Comment below. Would you have opened your door? But hold on, because Lord Critch wasn't finished yet. The fragile peace bought by Villain's words lasted less than a day. The village remained a tinderbox of suspicion, but the immediate threat of pitchforks had receded into watchful glares and slammed doors. It was a reprieve, not a pardon. But the true danger came not from the fearful villagers, but from the cold, calculating cruelty of bureaucracy. Lord Howell Critch arrived the next afternoon. He didn't send his bailiff this time. He came in person, a sure sign that the stakes had been raised. He rode a fine black horse that looked as smug as he did, and was flanked by 4 guards, twice the usual number. Critch was a thin man, dressed in dark, expensive wool that seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was a precise collection of sharp angles, and his eyes were like chips of grey flint. He carried a leather-bound ledger under his arm like a holy text. He dismounted with a practiced grace, his polished boots making no sound on the muddy ground. He didn't approach the hovel directly, but stood at a distance, surveying it with an expression of profound distaste, as if inspecting a particularly offensive piece of garbage. "Thorn," he called out, his voice thin but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "Present yourself." Villain's stomach turned to ice. Inside the shack, Kaza had already gathered Grak, her axe in her hand. The warrior was awake again, her posture radiating a deadly readiness. "This is the Leech Lord?" she whispered, her voice a low growl. "Yes," Villain breathed. "Don't do anything. Let me handle this." He stepped outside, squinting in the grey afternoon light. He tried to keep his shoulders straight, to not look as terrified as he felt. "My lord," he said, his voice tight, "you have my payment." "Your payment is the least of your concerns, Thorn," Critch interrupted, his lips curling into a semblance of a smile. "Though rest assured, your debt is now due, in full, immediately." He took a delicate step forward. "I have received a most disturbing report. A report that you are harboring a dangerous beast. More than one, in fact." His flinty eyes flickered toward the hovel. "The Baron pays a handsome bounty for orc heads. A bounty which conveniently would be more than enough to cover your long overdue debt. I am here to collect my due, Thorn, one way or another. My guards will seize the property and its contents." The guardsmen fanned out, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. They were forming a perimeter. There was no escape. Villain's mind was a maelstrom. Critch wasn't just collecting a debt. He was cashing in on a bounty. He would see Kaza and Grak killed and call it business. The injustice of it, the sheer, cold-blooded avarice, ignited a spark of defiance in Villain's weary soul. "They are not beasts," Villain said, his voice shaking but clear. "They are people, under my protection." Critch actually laughed, a dry, rustling sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Your protection? You can't even protect your own roof from the rain. You are a pathetic, penniless wretch, Thorn. You have no power here. You have no say." As if summoned by the escalating conflict, a new sound split the air. A war horn, deep, guttural, and utterly alien. It echoed from the woods, a sound of blood and iron that made the village dogs howl in terror. Everyone froze. Critch's guards exchanged nervous glances. Even Critch's smug expression faltered. From the tree line, they emerged. Orcs. At least a dozen of them. They were not like Kaza. They were clad in black iron armor adorned with bones and skulls. Their faces were painted with symbols of war, and they moved with a brutal, disciplined purpose. At their head rode a truly monstrous figure. He was huge, even for an orc. His shoulders as wide as a doorway. A jagged scar ran from his brow to his jaw, pulling one side of his face into a permanent snarl. He wore the pelt of a great black bear as a cloak, and in his hand he carried a massive, twin-bladed axe that seemed to drink the very light from the air. This was Thrathrak's skull render, and his eyes, burning with a cold, hateful fire, were locked on Villain's tiny hovel. The villagers, who had been cautiously peering from their windows, slammed their shutters closed. The world seemed to shrink to this one muddy patch of land, caught between two advancing predators. Thrathrak's gaze swept over the scene, dismissing Lord Critch and his men as irrelevant insects. His eyes found Violin. "You!" he boomed, his voice like grinding stones. "The little man with the broken house. You have something of mine. A deserter. A traitor. Give her to me now, and I will let you and your pathetic village burn quickly." Lord Critch, seeing his bounty about to be claimed by another, found his voice. "Now see here, these creatures are property of the barony. I am Lord Critch, and I am acting under the Baron's law." Thrathrak turned his massive head slowly to look at Critch. He grinned, a terrifying sight. "I am Thrathrak, Skull Render, and I am my own law." The door to the hovel creaked open. Kaza stepped out. She stood tall, her injured arm held tight to her side, but her good hand held her axe with white-knuckled certainty. Grak peeked out from behind her leg, his eyes wide with terror. "Thrathrak," Kaza called out, her voice ringing with a strength Villain had not heard before. "Your war is with me. Leave these people out of it." "War?" Thrathrak laughed, a horrible booming sound. "This is not a war, little traitor. This is an execution. And you have dishonored yourself by hiding behind this thing." He gestured dismissively at Violin. "This weak, soft-skinned maggot." The world was a crucible, and Villain was trapped in the center. On one side, the cold greed of Lord Critch, ready to sell lives for coin. On the other, the hot-blooded vengeance of Thrathrak, ready to burn the world to reclaim his property. Both saw Kaza and Grak not as people, but as objects, a debt to be collected, a traitor to be punished. And in that moment, something inside Villain snapped. The weariness, the fear, the years of being ground down by poverty and scorn, it all burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, unyielding iron. He stepped forward. He stood between Kaza and the two warlords of her fate. He, Violin Thorn, a man whose only weapon was a rusty key, was about to stand up to them all. "Enough," he said. His voice was not loud, it was not powerful, but it cut through the tension with the shocking clarity of a bell in a silent room. Thrathrak and Critch both stared at him, momentarily stunned by his audacity. "You call me weak," Villain said, his eyes locking on the giant orc warlord. "And you," he turned to Critch, "you call me pathetic. You are both right. I am not strong. I am not rich. I own nothing but this broken house and the clothes on my back." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusty key. He held it up, its dull metal glinting in the grey light. "This is all I have. A key. It's meant to open a door to a home, a place of safety, of warmth, of family. But this house, it has never been a home. It has been a shelter, a place to hide from the rain and the cold and the debt. It was just a place to be alone." His voice grew stronger, imbued with a conviction that came from the very depths of his soul. Then they came. He gestured with the key toward Kaza and Grak, and for the first time, there was someone to share a meal with, even if it was just thin soup. For the first time, there was someone to talk to, even if it was just about a leaky roof. They took my last bit of bread, and in return, they gave me a home. They filled this empty place with something other than my own lonely breathing. He took a step toward Thrathrak, an act so suicidal that one of Critch's guards gasped. "You stand there in your iron and bone and you talk of honor. What honor is there in hunting a child? What strength is there in sacrificing your own people for power? You call her a traitor, but she is more honorable in her desperation than you are in all your might. She is protecting her family. That is true honor." He then rounded on Lord Critch. whose face was a mask of disbelief. And you talk of law. You wave your ledger like a holy book, but it is nothing but a weapon to bleed poor people dry. You would see them dead for a handful of coins. You would trade their lives to settle a column of numbers. There is no law in that, only greed. A greed so vast it has hollowed you out and left a monster in your place. A profound silence fell over the muddy field. The villagers were listening. Khazar's orcs were listening. Even Thrathrak's warriors seemed to be listening. Villain's words, born of simple, honest truth, had more power than any sword. Thrathrak was the first to recover, his face contorting in rage. Words, the weapons of the weak. I will silence your tongue forever. He raised his massive axe, preparing to charge. No, Khazar shouted. She stepped forward, placing herself in front of Villain. She reached into a pouch at her belt, one Villain had never seen her open. She pulled out an object. It was not a weapon. It was a stone, a smooth, flat piece of dark, polished obsidian, no bigger than her palm. It was veined with what looked like shimmering, solidified silver. She held it high. Behold, she cried, her voice echoing with ancient authority. The honor stone of the first clan, the heart of our people. A collective gasp went through the ranks of the skull-render orcs. Their eyes, which had been filled with bloodlust, were now wide with awe and disbelief. They recognized the artifact. Lies, Thrathrak roared, but there was a flicker of panic in his eyes. The stone was lost in the Battle of the Ash Plains, lost with your father. It was not lost, Khazar declared, her voice ringing with truth. My father, the true chief of our clan, gave it to me before you murdered him in his tent and claimed he fell to the enemy. He knew you were corrupted. He knew you had abandoned the codes. She pointed at Thrathrak, not with her axe, but with the stone. You are Thrathrak the False, Thrathrak the Oathbreaker. You practice the dark arts. You sacrifice our children. You break every ancient bond that holds our people together. I do not stand here as a deserter. I stand here as the daughter of the true chief, and I invoke the right of challenge. You have no honor. You have no claim to leadership. The effect was immediate and seismic. Several of Thrathrak's own warriors took a hesitant step back. Their loyalty was not to a single orc, but to the clan, and the honor stone was its ultimate symbol. Khazar's words, combined with the impossible appearance of the stone, shattered their allegiance. One of the larger orcs, a captain with a scarred face, looked from the stone to Thrathrak and then back again. Doubt was plain on his face. The stone, it is real. She lies. Kill them all. Thrathrak screamed, his authority crumbling. He lunged not at Khazar, but at Valen, the source of this humiliation. He would crush the weak human first, but he never reached him. The scarred captain moved with surprising speed, his own blade coming up not to attack Khazar, but to block Thrathrak's axe. The clash of steel on steel rang out like a thunderclap. No more, Thrathrak, the captain growled. The chief's daughter has spoken. The stone has been revealed. Your reign is over. Two more of Thrathrak's warriors moved to stand with the captain, their weapons turning on their former leader. The rest of the warband hesitated, caught in a moment of shocking, violent schism. Thrathrak was surrounded by his own men, betrayed. He stared at them, his chest heaving, his face a mask of pure murderous fury. He was a warlord without an army, a king without a kingdom, defeated not by a rival warrior, but by the courage of a weak human and the honor of the woman he had tried to destroy. The crisis had broken, and the world would never be the same. The fight was short and brutal. Thrathrak, for all his rage and power, was one against three of his own best warriors. It was not a battle. It was a judgment. Steel rang against steel in the muddy clearing, a violent song of broken loyalty. The remaining skull-render warriors did not join in. They stood and watched, their faces grim, as their leader was disarmed and brought to his knees. The scarred captain, whose name was Grumok, stood over the defeated warlord. He looked to Khazar, his expression one of respect and deference. By the code, His life is forfeit. What is your command, daughter of the chief? Kaza looked at the kneeling Thrathrak, a being of pure hate and ambition now reduced to a prisoner. She could have ordered his death. Vengeance was hers for the taking. But she looked at Velan, standing shaken but resolute. She looked at her brother, Grak, peeking out from the doorway, safe. She remembered Velan's words about honor. "We are not him," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We do not answer blood with blood. The code demands justice, not butchery." She turned to the assembled orcs. "Thrathrak is stripped of his rank, his name, his clan. He is exiled. Let him wander the wastes as a no-one, his crimes his only companions. That is a fate worse than a quick death." Grummock nodded slowly, a deep respect dawning in his eyes. This was true leadership. This was wisdom. He and his warriors hauled the snarling, cursing Thrathrak to his feet and dragged him away into the wilderness, to a fate of utter anonymity. With the immediate danger gone, a strange quiet descended. There remained the second antagonist, the Leech Lord. Lord Critch had watched the entire exchange with a mixture of terror and avaricious calculation. As the orcs dealt with Thrathrak, he saw his own opportunity slipping away. Now, with Kaza clearly in a position of power, he shifted his tactics. He cleared his throat, plastering a sickly, sycophantic smile on his face. A most decisive resolution. A triumph of justice. As an agent of the Baron, I am pleased to see this criminal element dealt with. He gestured to Vylan's hovel. Of course, there is still the matter of the bounty on these esteemed guests. A formality, you understand. And the matter of Thorn's debt. Kaza turned her moss-green eyes on him. Her gaze was as cold and hard as the honor stone still clutched in her hand. There is no bounty, and his debt is a matter for negotiation. Negotiation? Critch scoffed, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. Debts are not negotiated. They are paid. It was then that Vylan stepped forward again. He was no longer the trembling man who had faced down a mob. There was a new steel in his spine. "You're right, my lord," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Debts should be paid." He turned to the villagers, who were now emerging from their homes, drawn by the silence that had followed the clash of arms. "Lord Critch speaks of my debt, but what of his debt to us, to this community?" Jorun the blacksmith, Elara's father, looked confused. "What debt, Velan?" "The debt of a leader to his people," Velan announced. "He collects our rents, our taxes. He claims it is for the good of the community. But what good has he done? My roof leaks. Mistress Weaver's well is tainted. The path to the market is a river of mud. Our struggles have mounted, year after year, while his ledger has grown fat. He takes, but he does not give. He is not a lord. He is a predator." A murmur went through the crowd of villagers. Velan's words were landing on fertile ground, tilled by years of quiet resentment. "I owed him for 2 sacks of seed last spring after the blight," called out an old farmer. "He charged me the price of 3, for risk. He fined me a silver piece because my chimney smoke was excessive," added another. One by one, the villagers began to speak. A dam of fear and silence had broken, and a flood of grievances poured out. The crowd's anger, once directed at the orcs, now turned with righteous fury upon the thin, pale man in the fine wool coat. Lord Critch's face went from white to red. "This is slander, insolence. I will have you all flogged." But his threats were empty. His 4 guards were looking nervously at the dozen heavily armed orcs who were now watching the proceedings with great interest. Grummock, the captain, grinned, showing a formidable set of tusks. He looked at Critch's guards, then at his own axe, and back again. The message was clear. Kaza stepped up beside Velan, a united front. "These people offer us sanctuary," she said to Grummock. "What do we offer them in return?" Grummock looked at the crumbling hovels, the muddy paths. "We are builders, stonemasons. We know the mountain and the forest. We can help them rebuild, make this place strong." Kaza then turned back to Critch. "Here is the payment for Villain's debt." Her voice was like iron. "My people will rebuild this entire village. We will dig a new well. We will pave the road. We will reinforce every home so it does not insult the wood. We will give this community more value than you have drained from it in a lifetime. That is our payment. And in return," her eyes narrowed, "you will cancel every outstanding debt in this village. You will return the exorbitant fees you have extorted, and then you will leave, and never come back." It was a shocking, audacious demand. Critch's jaw worked silently. He looked at the angry faces of the villagers, then at the sharp, waiting axes of the orcs. His authority was gone. His power was an illusion that had just been shattered. He had no choice. With a trembling hand, he unclasped his precious ledger, his holy book. He let it fall into the mud. He turned without another word, climbed onto his fine horse, and rode away, a disgraced and broken man. A wave of cheers erupted from the villagers. The resolution was swift and beautiful. The happy ever after was not a magical gift. It was earned, built with sweat and stone, and a revolutionary spirit of cooperation. The days that followed saw Oakhaven transformed. Khazar's orcs, free from Thrathrak's tyranny, were true to their word. They were masters of stonework and engineering. They worked alongside the human villagers, their initial awkwardness giving way to a shared sense of purpose. An orc mason showed Joran the blacksmith how to temper steel for chisel heads that wouldn't shatter on hard granite. Joran taught the orc how to shoe a pony without getting kicked. Mistress Weaver, who had once feared being eaten in her bed, found herself sharing tea and recipes with an orc woman who knew a dozen different ways to cook krala root. The children, after a day of fearful watching, began to play together. Human children were mesmerized by the orc children's skill at carving, and the orc children were fascinated by the human game of hide and seek. Prejudice, it turned out, was a wall that could be dismantled one shared task, one shared laugh, one shared meal at a time. Villain's hovel was the first project. They didn't just fix it. They tore it down, and in its place, they built a new house, a sturdy cottage of fieldstone and solid oak beams, with a roof that did not leak and a hearth that drew perfectly. Orcs and humans worked side by side, raising the walls. Vilin, who had only ever known how to patch and make do, learned how to build something to last. His role in the new, blended community was not that of a warrior or a builder. He was its heart, the bridge, the one who had seen people where others saw only monsters or numbers on a page. He and Kaza became the de facto leaders, not by title, but by the respect they had earned. They governed through council, listening to the needs of humans and orcs alike. One crisp evening, as the sun set behind the newly fortified village walls, Villain stood with Kaza and Grak in front of their new home. The air smelled of fresh-cut wood, baking bread, and the clean scent of rain on dust. A smell Villain no longer associated with leaks and misery. Grak had become Villain's other shadow, following him everywhere, chattering away in a mixture of the Orcish tongue and the common speech Villain was teaching him. The boy's talent for carving had blossomed. He was now carving the story of their meeting. A tiny, frail human offering a bowl to a giant, wounded orc, onto the new mantelpiece above the hearth. Villain reached into his pocket and pulled out the old rusty key. It didn't fit any lock on the new house. It was truly worthless now, a relic of a past life. He knelt down in front of Grak. "I want you to have this," he said softly, pressing the key into the boy's small green hand. Grak looked at the key, then up at Villain, confused. "It is broken. It opens nothing." "Oh, it opens the most important thing," Villain said, a smile touching his lips. "A long time ago, I thought it was the key to a house, but I was wrong. It was the key to a future I couldn't see. It reminds me that even when you think you have nothing, you still have a choice. And it reminds me that home isn't a place you lock with a key, it's the people you share it with. He gently closed Grak's fingers around the key. This is our house now, our home, family. Kaza placed a heavy, warm hand on Vilin's shoulder. She looked at the thriving village, a place of hope that had risen from the mud of despair. She looked at her brother, safe and happy. She looked at this kind, iron-willed human who had saved them with an act of simple, profound compassion. Different didn't mean enemy. It just meant you had more to learn from each other. And that is how a poor human and a desperate orc warrior proved that family is a choice, not blood. If this story touched your heart, please smash that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about compassion, overcoming fear. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even a rusty key can open a future. Thanks for watching.